It's me. I'm also wearing, I don't know if you guys noticed my Dialectics shirt today. Full void. Full void.
I love it. I saw it earlier and I was like, oh, it's so perfect. So we didn't expect to be doing this, but this is the beginning of episode 2 on dialectics.
Here we are. Jake and Matt have just trapped us in this office. And
yeah, they're sitting in their goddamn corners just making us talk all this shit about goddamn dialectics.
We're just drinking our water and eating pickles. But yeah, so we're going to get started on this. And all your questions will be answered, I promise.
Yes, I promise you will have a determinate one-sentence answer to what a dialectic is.
Dun, 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 dun.
Thank you.
So the German idealists to follow Kant, we've got Schelling, we've got Fichte, and then of course Hegel is looming very large right now in this discussion. I'm sure you can all feel we're just about to talk about him.
This Hegel's just chilling, just his ghost is.
Yeah, he's just like
got an arm. This is who I'm holding right here. This is Hegel.
There he is, with his dour expression that he always says. But
about Hades.
So Adorno says about this specific period of time we're talking about. He says, quote, "The dialectic must be regarded as Kantian philosophy, which has come to self-consciousness and self-understanding." So we're going to get really into this in the next Kant episode, but Kant doesn't quite bring us there. No. He's a little too unsure of the ground he's treading upon, and he's got other work to do.
Yeah.
And so the first sort of student of his to come along is Fichte.
Yeah.
And Fichte isn't a true student of Kant, but looked up to Kant. And, you know, I don't know about you and your research of Fichte, but Fichte holds a funny place in the development of the dialectic because some people will say that he had nothing to do with the dialectic and never talks about it.
He wasn't a dialectician.
And you'll also hear other people really refer to him in the Kantian sense, where he wasn't a dialectician, he was a synthesizer. He was a synthetician, something like that. Which I think kind of holds more true.
What I've come to see in just the little bit that I know, because I've read Schelling, I've read Kant, and I've read Hegel. I have not read Fichte except for little fragments.
Same. I have never read anything major by Fichte.
But what I have come to see is that there is a clear line of what he does to Kant, because Kant wrote his work in 3 books. And what did Fichte want to do? He wanted to make one system of pure reason. And the main way that he did so was by cleaving off noumena.
Right. He wanted to he didn't feel like you could have a holistic system with noumena, with acknowledging that you just can't know certain things.
So he takes up this fundamentally anti-realist position, and instead replaces it with intersubjectivity.
Right.
And the idea of the absolute ego. Ego equals ego, right? There's all these kind of internal contradictions that come up that he sees as being necessary to resolve. That, for instance, that, the philosopher must necessarily suspend their empirical experience and see the ego, their own ego, that's in empirical terms always a subject related to an object, but they must see it as a concept. And that begins the way to philosophy. But then after that, they must have this pure, like, intuitive experience, right, of kind of free will that will then allow them to take that concept and use it in a way that allows them to access absolute knowledge. And similarly, he has this relationship between the ego and the non-ego, how the ego necessarily requires the non-ego.
Right.
So, because what is non-ego? The object, again, is part of the absolute ego. Everything is our perception in his system. And in that regard, there is massive implications for how Hegel would write. Because, as we will see, or we can talk about right now, Schelling and Hegel, they were contemporaries. And Schelling, much like Fichte, got a job from Goethe, right? And it's almost as if Goethe found Schelling as like an antidote to what he was hearing from Hegel and Fichte, right? Which is that this natural world, this world of noumena, isn't even real. Like, forget it.
Right.
You know, for Fichte, it's absolute ego and various internal contradictions. For Hegel, it's the dialectic, right?
Yeah, and I mean, for Fichte, like, where the dialectic comes into play with him, and why I think he's so important for what is to follow with Hegel, is so for Fichte, he basically decides, like, kind of what you're saying about this ultimate ego idea, that so he comes up with this first principle, like das Ich, like I am I, the I, right? And the reason I bring this up, because I'm not going to get into it too much, but he really wanted that this, like, first principle be not a fact that is experienced, but an act. This act that is rational. And so he kind of conceived it as this I am I, this creation of self. And where the dialectic comes in, as you talk about the non-ego, is that what you have is the sort of extension of Kant's sort of formulation and understanding of this subject-object relationship. And, I think in the heart of the matter, this is often what dialectics is about, is this subject-object relationship, that we can critique the subject, and through doing that, we may learn something about the object, right? Yeah. So through critiquing phenomena, and this is what Kant would say, is that maybe there's a chance to make noumena less, to make the territory that it has less. Yeah. And that maybe there's a path to learn more about the other. Yeah. And so, despite the, like, very strange contradictions and sort of falling from grace that Fichte experiences in his career, I think what he does set up, particularly for Hegel to run with, is this subject-object antinomy.
And also, in that subject-object, because what he says is, you can experience an object, but you don't get absolute knowledge of it, right?
Right.
This idea of partial identity, right? He has this idea where, yeah, we experience an object. Oh, I see the cup, but I don't know every aspect of that cup, right? So we're containing with these partial identities, but to reach absolute knowledge, right? We have to go through this process of understanding what is absolute ego, understanding how the cup is part of ourselves, and in that we find understanding in this process, and that does hold a closeness to what Hegel was doing, whereas compared to Schelling, who is more closely thought with Hegel, right? I actually see far less closeness. I see him as far more objective than idealist. I see him far more as a naturalist. Yeah. Right? And I don't see...
Yeah, I mean, he's more of a German idealist in that functionary of German nationalism and this, like, identity to the land, right?
Yeah. But he almost seemed to be more theological. I mean, Fichte was quite radical politically, and Hegel, while not radical, was left of right most of the time, particularly in his views on Haiti. But for Schelling, it seemed like his ultimate end was in a critique of both Kant and Hegel. Because for Kant, right, when he gets to his third book, Critique of Judgment, and he has this aesthetic idea, he's thinking, I cannot actually ascertain that you are more than just another object, according to the Transcendental analytic, right? I have to assume as much.
Of course.
I automatically do. But
and Kant would insist that you must take every human as an ends and not a means. You know, that you must treat everyone like you treat like a subject.
But at the same time, aesthetically, you cannot know it.
Exactly.
And for Schelling, this creates a problem. He sees in kind of what he would describe as the naive philosophy of the past, as we were kind of realizing this difference between mind and body, the ability, as we see in the kind of Indian and Chinese traditions, of, you know, treating this kind of flowing reciprocal synthesis between nature and the self, right? And, you know, Goethe similarly was frustrated with this denial of objectivity, right? This denial of the object as object. And you see in his natural philosophy an attempt to go past the Kantian sublime, to find this almost emotional experience, and to see through art, through human art, a means of greater understanding as our way of actually connecting and creating the power of nature. But through most of it, his relation to Hegel seems critical. That he sees absolute knowledge, as Hegel would describe it, as only a description of absolute knowledge because it lacks nature.
Yeah, and I think actually goes on to sort of help create the myth of Hegel too. I mean, because really the critique that Schelling's bringing, I think, is still pertinent today, and it's pertinent against Kant, that there is this sort of a priori emotional sense that we have that is much more included in, say, the Buddhist or in the Tao, that kind of conception of the world that is still maybe lacking in Hegel. But you can't do it all.
Yeah, you can't do it all. And Hegel, as we can get to now, Hegel's task was so immense, and his scope was so immense that, you know, to bring that criticism is necessary, but it doesn't get entirely how drastically he changed dialectics and defined, getting back to where we began, why everyone in art, in theory, etc., throws this word around. You know?
Right, definitely. So yeah, let's chomp to the meat of this matter. Do you want to try and just give a really basic conception of Hegel's aims here? Because I think that's a good place to start. And obviously, it's a huge book that we will go into much more in depth later. But it's important enough where maybe we should take a little bit of time and to talk about what he set out to do and then what he did do.
Well, I saw a very good description of the basic functions of what they said was the Western dialectic, but really the Hegelian dialectic, right? And it's by a guy named Velsvilad Halapnuki. I don't know how to pronounce that.
I guarantee you.
That's harder than any of the other names that we said. So, you know, anyway, he said that it was 1, the law of development through contradiction; 2, the law of mutual interconnection; 3, the law of transformation of opposites into their own opposites when brought to an extreme; and 4, the law of the spiral form of development of things. And then in Hegel's own distinction, he saw the dialectic as having 3 specific points, right? Number 1 is fixity. Number 2 is the dialectical, or the negatively rational, as he put it. And 3, which has been put many ways, he calls the speculative, the positively rational, or as we would know it, the negation of negation,
right,
which is also called sublation, right? So in describing Hegel's dialectic, I think what it essentially does is it takes an object, right, and it turns that object into a proposition, right, and then it opposes that proposition with sort of its most extreme negation. One, for instance, we can do the classic one. There is being, right? Its negation is nothing, right? But naturally, being is not its past self. Being is going through a process of changing. And therefore, when they are synthesized, the most extreme of nothing is the changing of being. We find becoming, right? And in that, you can kind of see just one of the archetypal forms of his process.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested to hear what
and of dialectics in total, right? Because, let's look at that, just briefly pause on it a second. So being, we're going to try and negate it. We're going to try and eliminate it because, the cool thing about the Hegelian dialectic is it's very much returning to these Platonic ideas of achieving something positive through negation.
Yes.
Like we are going to find a truth, we are going to figure something out by critiquing it, by trying to prove it wrong, these kinds of attempts. And so like this is kind of really the most extreme example of this. We have being. Well, what is its opposite? It's non-being, nothing. But being is also, when you start looking at it this way, well, being is also nothing. It's not a glass. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not negated by non-being, or it's not negated by nothing. And through that process of subsuming that new understanding that we can't quite put anywhere, that we know is true but doesn't make sense, we wind up with becoming, and that okay, if being is actually not a thing, then it's a process, then it's an act, then it's something, and so you of course get the entire freeing of sort of Western thought into this more dynamic sphere where existence is not a fixed thing, it is this dynamic thing, it is a process, it is becoming, right?
Yeah, and what you define about the formal process is so important about your description of nothing. He is not creating abstraction. These are not supposed to be abstract propositions.
Right.
But rather, we're supposed to see in pushing them to that extent of abstraction how they dissolve into one another, right? That you could easily, as I actually did prior to this, in this quicker description of it, just said, okay, there's being, and then but being transforms is nothing. But that does not address nothing completely, right? That nothing itself, that being itself is nothing in a sense, and that nothing itself is being in a sense, and that it's a reciprocal relationship, and that's what's so important to grasp in the Hegelian dialectic, is that in each step there, before the sublation, before the negation of negation, before it imminently grows to a greater concept, that these two ideas must relate in this complex way where there is information going in each direction, fulfilling the other concepts, and allowing you to learn more about both concepts, being and nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's what it's like the being turning into becoming is this like pivotal point in the history of philosophy. But sometimes its ramifications I think get missed because it's such a cool like being into becoming, it feels so freeing and emancipatory. But even eschewing those concepts themselves, the act of dialectics, the process, the goal of it is almost witnessing the growth and change of a concept to such an extent that it becomes something else, that it becomes different, so that the concept you started with is now a different concept. And so the sort of importance of the dialectic of this process is that it actually changes the world, and it changes both the concrete thing you're dealing with and how you understand it, but in the other direction, also the sort of absolute and our understanding of the sort of nominal world,
Yes.
right? And that it's this ever moving transitory concept, and that's why describing what the dialectic is, talking about dialectics, is so hard and is often so misunderstood, because dialectics itself works that way, and the more you know about it, the more the concept of that methodology changes and becomes something new.
Yes.
And so it makes it hard to talk about and kind of confusing, but it also makes it an incredibly powerful tool.
Yes. So I think what we can say that's important about it, that will distinguish it from other theories of change, right? Because what would follow are other theories of change and critiques of the dialectic. But is that in its limitation to these two concepts, right, it sets formal limits on how you reach this new concept. It shows that this relationship of a dualism turns into one, right? Whereas it isn't simply talking about a manifold like Kant would, right? The manifold of perception, or later, as Nietzsche would, the manifold of perspective, right? It is something that is easily, formally applicable, right? Something that you can go and take looking at even more complex objects, right? Like, say you're using critical race theory or something like that, and you want to apply the dialectic through that, and you want to think about the concept of the black person versus the white person, or whatever, or maybe spin it around, right? In both cases, where you start your thesis, you will find an interesting way of thinking about the other through the way that you present those things. If you say that the black person is the thesis, or the white person is the thesis, and then try to negate the other, you start to see how, and this is also important to Hegel, historically, contextually, linguistically, that these concepts are mutually dependent.
Right.
That they will naturally create something more. Maybe we could say race. What is the negation of race, right? And we could say it's humanity or something like that. And in that process, I'm not sure if the dialectic has been done. I don't have a solution myself. But what we would come out with, what would come through our thinking through these concepts, would be something that is more complex and is more useful in representing some whole.
And at that point is so important, because that's the thing with dialectics. It's not about finding solutions. That's specifically not what the process accomplishes. It does not solve any problems, because when you get through it, where are you at? You're at a new problem.
Yeah.
Right? And so I believe it was Adorno, but one of the best ways that I found to think about the dialectical process is this concept of uniting identity with non-identity.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the same process or the same antinomy of subject-object, and it's uniting these two things that cannot be the same, but which must be, because they're both contained within our concept of identity, of being.
Yes.
Right? And so it's this incredibly powerful tool in that way, because it is, as far as the spiral direction that you mentioned of the Hegelian dialectic. I can't remember the Russian guy's name, but is very fundamental, because that is sort of the aim of a dialectic, is sort of the return, right? And this comes up in Nietzsche and all these other things. But at that moment of return, both the place you are returning to and the person you are incredibly different.
Now, what I would say is the limit of the Hegelian system is his idea of the absolute, right? He does cleave noumena just like Fichte cleaves noumena. Now, he's far more attendant to the world, and therefore there isn't the same sense of anti-realism because he's applying it to history, he's applying it to events. As we get with the Slave-Master Dialectic, he's mythologizing this process through which the slave can reach consciousness through conflict, through fear, through work, through struggle, and so on.
Through escaping the non-identity that he has been given from his master.
And just as the master cannot achieve identity because they're mediating their relationship with things to the other person, to the worker, right? These things are very thoughtful. But when you get to this notion of absolute knowledge, the movement from the individual, the most simple things here and now, right, all the way to the totality of knowledge, which will fundamentally be resolved in institutions and state, right, there is a certain teleology to it that limits it. And as we'll get to our final part, I think has an influential limitation on the next great, and maybe in some sense the final transformation of the dialectic in Marx.
So I've got the perfect quote for you for that transition. I of course didn't write what book I got this from, but it was one of his early writings. I think it was even earlier than the Grundrisse, so whatever it may have been. But Karl Marx writes, and again, ding, 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 like probably all you've been waiting for is like, what the heck is dialectical materialism? Well, we're here, so we're going to talk about it. But Karl Marx writes, setting out from idealism, I hit upon seeking the idea in the real itself. And formerly the gods had dwelt above the world, they had now become its center. And so Hegel, writing about the Hegelian dialectic and the phenomenology of the spirit, is coming off of Kant. He's concerned about the metaphysical. He's concerned about that which is greater than our physical world. He's questions about the absolute, about the unknowable. And Karl Marx gets this idea from Engels, who writes a book, the Dialectic of the Natural.
Yes.
That this is actually an amazing tool for society, and that this is a tool that can be used in the material makeup of culture and society, and thus the actual lived experiences of the people who live in it. Right? And so this is basically becomes what is called as historical materialism.
Yes, there are two aspects to Marx's system. There is historical materialism and dialectical materialism. And I think they can broadly be separated into, one is dealing with how the movement of human activity can go towards utopia, right? Through this dialectical analysis of history, and it is an ex post facto analysis, and therefore open to critique as projection, but in many ways it's so predictive that it resists that critique. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, at looking at these particular antinomies, these particular contradictions that rise in society through our economy, through our capitalist economy now, that remain unresolved, and that he theorizes through economy can be resolved in communism. So I saw an interesting diagram, right? And it showed kind of the figures, the human figures of his historical dialectic, his historical materialism. And it said the patricians to the plebeians to the feudal lords, to the serfs, to the bourgeois capitalists, to the proletarian workers, with revolution, and then to communism, which is ultimately imagined as a utopian form. But where he begins before that is much like this master-slave dialectic, is in observing that there is a central aspect of work in coming to consciousness, and that there's a central aspect of work in the demands of our present, or as his present, and now that is evolved, industrialized society. So he comes up with all of these distinctions, means and ends, right?
Yeah, and he's applying this idea of like the Hegelian dialectic in the actual formulation of the world. So not that things are fated, but this is why revolution enters into his sort of philosophy, is that he's taking a dialectical approach to his society, and there needs to be some method of
resolution.
Yeah, of subulation,
sublation.
Yes, excuse me, sublation. And what is that going to be? Because the dialectic, and you've got to remember this when talking about Marx, is, again, it's not something that is a thing that produces solution, right?
Yeah.
And so if he's looking at his world, and what he is living in is the start of the liberal world, where we've got to remember that the ideals of that time period, given to us from Locke and
Berkeley,
exactly,
and so on, yeah.
all his interlocutors. Hobbes was the guy I was thinking of. Thank you. The Leviathan. But is this world in which our subjective lives, that we can create meaning out of our subjective lives, and those subjective experiences are of the highest value, yet living in a world that, much like in a sort of analogous way to like Hegel's master-slave dialectic, is the exact opposite.
Yeah,
and
that we suffer.
Right, and so he's presented with this contradiction of his society, that it is one which we value these things that we actively suppress.
And in this sense, that is why Marx's materialist dialectic is often thought of as kind of like this pinnacle point from which now all dialectics kind of spawn, but do not transform, is because he really goes and puts the dialectics through every level.
Right.
As you pointed out, he's looking at a society and seeing the internal contradictions. But, for instance, he could look at something like the relationship between production and consumption, and he would apply the dialectic to that, right? And I have like the examples of his description here, right? Production needs consumption. Production necessitates consumption of raw materials and a need for labor. Production diminishes consumption. Production reduces what is available for consumption. Consumption needs production. Produces objects and sometimes needs of consumption. Consumption diminishes production. Reduces what is available for productive consumption, right? So he goes into like all of these aspects of our capitalist society, and he shows that there are all these mutually sustaining contradictions that are unresolved, and that the primary means of this is through a stratification of class, of a dialectic of class between bourgeois society and proletarian society. And so naturally, for him, following Hegel, where it resolved in the absolute, he resolves in the kind of utopian end of revolution and communism. Now, it begs the question against Aristotle's rules, as this dialectic has, flouted Aristotle's rules greatly, if that utopia is possible. We talked about this on the last episode, the NFTs episode, but that teleology, that it is necessary that we find communism, that communism will be utopian, will always be the greatest means of critique against it.
Yeah.
But it does not actually get to the content of what Marx is talking about.
Well, and I mean, that's, I think, the most amazing thing about Marx and his dialectical materialism is that, while there is always this critique, right? So in a nutshell, his dialectical materialism is the contradiction of the bourgeois social relations, which values the individual, versus the capitalist mode of production, which absolutely does not value the individual, or only values the individual in a consumptive way.
Yes.
His sort of short answer to what that dialectic made for him was that communism is the next phase of human societal development. Obviously the biggest critique against him would be like, well, okay, that didn't happen, although it has in certain areas.
Yeah.
But you cannot read Marx and not see the incredibly numerous ways in which his dialectic has been proven utterly true.
Yes.
Whether it's the neo-imperialism, whether it's the alienation and loss of and kind of atomization of our personal lives,
Yes.
it compounded exponentially so by the internet and computers, and all these small things, and for me, which actually brings up a greater critique as far as the dialectic is concerned, is that this sort of like obsession with communism is kind of the reification of the dialectical system.
Yes.
In that, our current society, our current place, could also use a dialectical look at it, and it might lead to something similar, but that as soon as that Karl Marx did his work, we were presented with a new dialectic,
Yes.
And I feel like we've kind of ossified ourselves on his interpretation.
I would agree absolutely, and I think this is a good place to kind of find our end, because I think as we go on in this series, right, we will meet Hegel and we will meet Marx, but we will also meet in Nietzsche and in Deleuze, right, the philosophers of difference, right, and in difference there is, now referring back to earlier concept, the positive theory of flux, of change, of transformation, of relations. It does not rely on what could be assumed of Hegel, at least, representation, of formalism, of teleology, right?
Conflict.
Yes. Yes, the strict contradiction of things, right? In the regards of the two aforementioned thinkers, contradiction doesn't really exist, right? All that exists is complexity, right? And so I think what we can learn about the dialectic is that there isn't a right or wrong to the dialectic, as I think you have been pointing out for the latter part of this conversation, but rather that the dialectic is a tool, and it is a tool applied in better or worse ways, in more interesting or more hypostatized ways, as Kant would say, and that in our present, as we are grasping with the apparent flaws of our economic system, of the failures of capitalism, that we should be open to all of the methods, and that dialectics in its new form, and even going back,
right,
reading Indian dialectical ideas, reading Muslim ideas on dialectics, could give us a way of trying to grasp the dynamism of society and to find a better way to resolve the contradictions. And then at the same time, that we should not be limited to writers of the 19th century, that we can also not feel that the dialectic is what is it, a $4 word, or I forget the phrase, but
$10 word.
$10 word, whatever. I guess I'd only buy it for $4 on the flea market. But that, that it isn't just something that represents complex thought, but it's actually something you use and do something with, and that you can create good or resolve a problem or find a truth in it. Whether that's a transcendental truth or a personal truth, that remains to be seen. But it is meaningful.
Yeah, and I mean, it kind of goes back to something we were talking about early on and getting ready for this. The dialectic is a verb more than it is a noun.
Yes.
And it is active, and it is a moving process. And I think,
it's kind of a ending statement. I think what you said is actually absolutely right. And kind of, I think the hope of this show is a kind of dialectical process on the history of philosophy and in finding the contradictions between the thinkers of many different times and places and cultures and the unification of those ideas.
Yeah.
And that will open up new pathways for us, and further our understanding and bring up new problems for us to consider. So but yeah, that's
dialectics for you, folks.
That's the dialectic.
Buy a dialectic, $4.
You heard it here first. You won't find prices that low anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so yeah, if you want to buy our dialectics, hit that subscribe button. We've got a Patreon that you can contribute. We're working on some stickers right now and some other goodies. So follow our Facebook page or whatever to stay abreast of those developments. And
yeah,
signing off.
Dialectics for everyone.